I know people always complain about the refs, but come on, Marvin the Martian, call something. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 1996 live-action animated hybrid sports comedy, Space Jam. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Space Jam stars Michael Jordan, Wayne Knight, Bill Murray, and the Looney Tunes, and was directed by Joe Pytka. During his initial retirement from the NBA, Michael Jordan is recruited by the Looney Tunes to help them win a basketball game against a team of aliens who are trying to enslave them. Space Jam is an incredibly bizarre movie. It's one of those films that sounds like it's made up. It sounds like a joke. A live-action animated hybrid movie where Michael Jordan plays basketball with the Looney Tunes and some aliens? What? It sounds utterly ridiculous. And it is. But it works. Sort of. It's certainly a product of its time, and it's a film that I don't think works outside of the context and mindset of that time period. Everything from the stars, to the humor, to the soundtrack, this is a mid-90s time capsule. And so, I gotta say up front here, I think this is one of those movies where if you didn't experience it at the time of release, you're probably not gonna get it. You'll understand the plot, or at least what there is to understand about it, but you won't be able to understand why it was so big and such a cultural phenomenon for kids in the 90s. Having watched it countless times as a kid, and playing that PlayStation game for so many hours, my opinion of this film is definitely colored a bit by nostalgia. And it's one of those situations where I honestly don't know how I would feel about it if I were to watch this for the first time as an adult now. It's an almost indescribably strange film, so I think I would just be baffled more than anything else. It's got its ridiculously bizarre premise going for it, but the actual story isn't anything overly special. At its core, it has a pretty basic underdog sports comedy plot. In fact, having just rewatched it, I was surprised by how little actually happens in this movie. The first half of the story is kind of just the setup for this weird situation, and then the basketball game at the center of the story is pretty much the entirety of the second half. There are little mini side adventures and some pretty funny moments with Bill Murray, as well as with the NBA players who had their talents stolen, but this is a surprisingly lean story, and it's got a runtime to match. Officially, it's a breezy 88 minutes long, but if you were to take out the end credits and the oddly long and chaotic opening credits, I wouldn't be surprised if this movie clocked in under 80 minutes. With that short of a runtime and so little meat on its plot bones, the story, and certainly the characters, never have time to breathe or develop. But it really moves, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't engaging in its absurdity. Speaking of its absurdity, I think it's safe to say that the bulk of the oddity here stems from the Looney Tunes aspect of the story. So part of that's inherently obvious considering the Looney Tunes are wacky and weird in and of themselves. Now, I'm definitely not a Looney Tunes expert. I watched the shorts and the related shows some as a kid, but I would say that the majority of my Looney Tunes experience comes from Space Jam. And I've heard that some of the characters come across as kind of out of character here, but at least for me, it's always been pretty solid, slapsticky, irreverent Looney Tunes fun. Bugs and his sarcastic fourth wall breaks, Taz and the court spitshine, Tweety in an iron lung. Characters are humorously and cartoonishly squashed, stretched, shot, deflated, and maimed in all sorts of classic Looney Tunes ways. There's also plenty of self-referential humor, as well as references to other movies, ranging from Patton to Pulp Fiction. So, the Looney Tunes characters themselves add to the wackiness of the story, but perhaps even more bizarre is the integration of those characters and the hybrid crossover that occurs. We had seen this type of animated live-action hybrid before. There were older examples like Mary Poppins, and more recent, at the time, examples like the very relevant Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So, technologically speaking, this wasn't anything overly groundbreaking, but I think it was pretty effective and mostly still holds up. The animation still looks really good, and I can still remember how cool it was to see the three-dimensional depth in the 2D animated world as the camera would sweep around. At the time, I used to think the hybrid elements were amazing. Now, they're decent. It's very obvious that Michael Jordan was just acting by himself in front of a green screen, which, when combined with the fact that he's not an actor, certainly contributes to the woodenness of his performance, but aside from some instances of mismatched or flat lighting, I think he looks okay within the animated world. In spite of the entertainment that I gleaned from this movie, I concede that this is not an objectively good film. It's weird and wild, very random, and just head-shakingly bizarre. As I said before, it's the kind of movie that sounds fake, and once you watch it, you're gonna be thinking, who thought of this movie? Who greenlit this movie? And how did this thing ever possibly become a reality? But it did, and at least for the youth of the 90s, and their unfortunate parents, it was a bit of a cultural phenomenon. Today, Space Jam is certainly a film that's bolstered by nostalgia. It's a very potent distillation of the 90s, a time capsule, but it's one that I like to dig up and open every few years. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one has got to be the concept. And I imagine this is something that could just as easily top many people's cons lists, but there's just something so intriguing and engaging about this ridiculous premise. Even as somebody who's never been that big of a Looney Tunes fan, or much of a basketball or Michael Jordan fan, I'm always highly entertained by the absurdity of it all. I know it had its origins in a couple Nike commercials from the early 90s, but it's one of those weird mashup movies that really makes no sense, and combines two things that I honestly don't even think a little kid could have thought to combine. But something about that, about the randomness, just works. The second pro is one that I actually kind of surprised myself with, and that's the soundtrack. It's one of those things that when I was a kid and growing up with this movie was never the big draw for me, but now it's one of the most surprising highlights. I mentioned it before, but this movie is such an encapsulation of its time period, and so the soundtrack is absolutely stacked with 90s pop hits. Everything from the Space Jam theme song, to Fly Like an Eagle, to Pump Up the Jams, to Get Ready. You know, you all ready for this? It's just one of those elements of this movie that really takes me back to watching this as a kid and instantly puts a smile on my face. On the con side, there are a million ways to pick apart this movie, but the only major thing that sticks out to me, aside from the excessively lean story, has gotta be the performances. The voice performances are all great from the Looney Tunes actors, so I'm mostly talking about the live action performances here. The only one that I truly enjoy is Bill Murray. He's very briefly in the movie, in kind of a weird role, but he's got some really good lines, and he's just very funny to me here. Wayne Knight is the only other real actor in a somewhat major role, but he's a little too much, and fairly grating for me. In terms of the basketball players, the small roles are entertaining, but mostly quite stilted in their line delivery, and Michael Jordan's okay. He comes across a little wooden at times, but he had to carry this movie as the main actor while not actually being an actor, and had to deliver the majority of his performance in front of a green screen to nothing, which is a difficult thing even for real actors, so I can't really knock his performance too much. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Space Jam or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Space Jam 3.5 out of 5 paws. Admittedly, this is a bit influenced by nostalgia, and it'd probably be a half paw lower without it, but in spite of some story and performance issues, this is one very bizarre yet entertaining film. I would recommend Space Jam, mostly to people who've seen the film before. It might not live up to your memories, but I think if you have at least some nostalgia for it, you're probably gonna enjoy it more. Fans of basketball or Michael Jordan will probably get a kick out of certain elements, fans of the Looney Tunes out of other elements, and if you're somebody who just wants to take a look at a very bizarre piece of 90s pop culture, this wouldn't be a bad place to start. If you liked Space Jam, I would recommend Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's another fairly bizarre movie that blends live action and animation, this time as a noir-influenced detective story rather than a sports comedy. If you really enjoyed seeing the Looney Tunes interact with human characters, you might want to check out Looney Tunes Back in Action. It's a very goofy film that developed from what was supposed to be a Space Jam sequel, though the story is quite different. And if you don't care about the animated aspect, but want another silly recruitment-based basketball movie starring real basketball players, you should watch Uncle Drew. It stars Kyrie Irving and a whole slew of NBA and WNBA players in old age makeup, and interestingly, developed from a commercial, just like Space Jam did. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Space Jam? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that blends live action and animation? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.